interfering with my official duties. That is a crime, Captain.
The only thing I'm interfering with is your path to the morgue. This conversation is over.
That's it! You're under arrest for obstruction! Evans, cuff him!
The hum was the first sign of trouble. It was a low, predatory sound, an unnatural thrum that vibrated through the soles of Fire Captain Mike Ramirez's steel-shanked boots. It was the sound of 12,000 volts of raw power, untethered and angry. A summer squall had ripped through the suburban artery of Oak Creek Drive, tearing a thick limb from an ancient oak tree. The limb, heavy with rainwater, had fallen directly onto a primary power distribution line, snapping it like a dry twig. Now, one end of the severed cable lay coiled in the middle of the street, its insulation stripped back, exposing the copper conductor that pulsed with an invisible, lethal energy. The other end, still attached to the pole, dangled and swayed in the post-storm breeze, spitting blue-white sparks that hissed as they died on the wet asphalt. Engine 12 had been the first on the scene. At 45, Mike Ramirez moved with the economy of motion that came from 2 decades of fighting fires, pulling people from mangled cars and managing chaos. He wasn't a man of wasted words or actions. His dark hair was cut short, his jaw was square, and his eyes, the color of worn denim, missed nothing. They swept the scene with a practiced, methodical gaze, assessing the threats in order of priority. The downed line was priority 1, 2, and 3. All right, listen up. Ramirez's voice cut through the air, calm but carrying an authority that required no volume. This is a hot zone, full kill box. Nobody, and I mean nobody, goes past the engine. Diaz, Martinez, full perimeter. I want yellow tape from that mailbox to the fire hydrant across the street. Generous circle. 30-foot minimum standoff from the line. I want a second line of cones outside that. This isn't a suggestion. It's a non-negotiable. His firefighters, Hector Diaz and Leo Martinez, moved without hesitation. They knew the captain's tone. They'd heard it at 3 alarm structure fires and complex extrications. It was the voice of command, forged in experience and backed by an encyclopedic knowledge of physics and protocol. They began unreeling the wide, bright yellow, "Fire line do not cross" tape, their movements efficient and precise. Ramirez watched the downed line. It wasn't arcing wildly, but it was alive. He could feel it. The danger wasn't just the cable itself, but the ground around it. The wet asphalt was a perfect conductor. Electricity, lazy and merciless, would always seek the path of least resistance to ground. Right now, that path was radiating outward from the cable in concentric rings of lethal voltage. It created a phenomenon every firefighter is trained to fear: step potential. A person walking near the line could have one foot in a high-voltage zone and the other in a slightly lower one. The current would see the path of least resistance not as the ground, but as the human body, traveling up one leg and down the other, cooking every organ in between. It was an invisible, silent killer. "Cap, perimeter set," Diaz called out, his voice slightly muffled by the sound of a police cruiser approaching. "Good. Now double it," Ramirez ordered without looking away from the wire. "I don't want any civilians getting curious. This isn't a spectacle." He turned to his engineer, a veteran named Sam Jones who was manning the truck's controls. "Sam, get on the horn to the utility company. I want an ETA for a kill crew. Tell them it's a primary distribution line down in a residential area. Emphasize it's actively energized and unsecured. Use the magic words." Jones nodded, already keying his radio. Magic words was code for a situation with immediate, life-threatening potential that required bumping their request to the top of the utility's priority list. A black-and-white county sheriff's cruiser pulled up, stopping a dozen feet short of Engine 12's rear bumper. The emergency lights sliced through the humid afternoon air, painting the scene in strobing flashes of red and blue. Two deputies stepped out. The driver was older, his face etched with the weary patience of a man who had seen it all. The passenger, however, was a different story. He was young, no older than 30, with a sharp, athletic build and the kind of restless energy that often translated into impatience. His nameplate read K. Miller. His partner's read J. Evans. Deputy Miller's eyes scanned the scene quickly, taking in the fire engine, the tape, and the small crowd of neighbors who had begun to gather at a safe distance. His gaze settled on the downed power line, and a look of dismissive confidence crossed his face. He walked toward the yellow tape, his partner, Evans, following a few steps behind. Ramirez saw them coming. He had worked with law enforcement on hundreds of scenes. Most were professionals. They understood the concept of unified command, where the agency best equipped to handle the primary hazard, in this case. The fire department for a downed line took the lead. But every so often, you got a cowboy, someone who saw yellow tape not as a warning, but as a challenge to their authority. Ramirez had a sinking feeling he was looking at one right now. He walked to the edge of the perimeter he had established, positioning himself directly in their path. He stood with his arms crossed loosely over the reflective lettering on his turnout coat. F.D. Captain. His stance was relaxed but immovable. "Afternoon, deputies," Ramirez said, his tone even and professional. "Appreciate the backup. For your safety and everyone else's. I need you and your vehicle to stay back behind the engine. We've got a live primary line down. The whole area is energized." Deputy Miller stopped just short of the tape, his eyes narrowing slightly. He looked from Ramirez to the wire, then back to Ramirez. He didn't seem to see a fire captain ensuring safety. He saw an obstacle. "We got a call about a traffic hazard, Captain," Miller said, his voice laced with an edge of condescension. "We need to assess the situation and get the road reopened." "The road stays closed until the utility company cuts the power and grounds the line," Ramirez stated, his voice remaining level. It was a simple statement of fact, not a negotiation point. "The situation is assessed. It's a 12,000-volt death trap. Stepping past this tape is a fatal mistake. There's nothing for you to do in there." Miller's jaw tightened. He glanced at his partner, who gave a slight, almost imperceptible shrug, content to let the fire department handle it. But Miller wasn't content. He saw the yellow tape not as a shield, but as a challenge to the hierarchy he believed in, where his badge trumped all others. "We'll be the judge of that," Miller said, his hand resting on the tape. Ramirez didn't move. He just held the deputy's gaze. "No, son. On this scene, I will. And I'm judging that you're about to do something stupid. So, for your own good, take a step back." The air, already thick with the smell of rain and ozone, suddenly became charged with a new kind of energy. It wasn't 12,000 volts of electricity, but the volatile current of a bruised ego. And Captain Mike Ramirez knew, with the certainty of a man who had seen countless tragedies born from arrogance, that the live wire on the ground might not be the most dangerous thing on this street anymore. Deputy Kyle Miller was 29 years old, with 5 years on the force and a reputation that was still being written. In the locker room and at the briefing table, he was known for being sharp, aggressive, and ambitious. He'd been a standout defensive back on his college football team, and he carried himself with the same coiled spring intensity, a confidence that often bordered on swagger. He saw the world as a series of challenges to be met and overcome, a field of play where dominance was the goal, His supervisors saw his arrest numbers and his proactive stops and called it good police work. His peers, however, sometimes saw something else: a chip on his shoulder, a need to be the one in charge, regardless of the situation. His partner, Deputy John Evans, was a decade older and cut from a different cloth. Evans was a pragmatist. He understood the unwritten rules of interagency cooperation. He knew that when the fire department set up a hot zone, you respected it. Fire captains didn't draw lines in the sand for fun. They did it because they understood hazards that law enforcement officers weren't trained to see. Evans had already made his own assessment. A downed power line spitting sparks was a job for the fire department and the utility company. Their role was simple: keep people back and divert traffic. It wasn't complicated, but Miller viewed cooperation through the lens of jurisdiction. To him, a public street fell under the purview of the sheriff's department. The yellow tape was a suggestion, and the man in the heavy coat was giving an order he had no right to give. "With all due respect, Captain," Miller said, emphasizing the title with a slight sneer, "this is a public roadway. It's our job to secure it. We need to get a look at that vehicle down there." He gestured vaguely down the street, where a sedan was parked 100 feet away, well outside the danger zone but technically within the taped-off perimeter. It was a flimsy pretext, and everyone on the scene knew it. Ramirez's expression didn't change. His patience was a deep well, but he could feel the bottom of it approaching faster than usual. "Deputy, there is no assessing to be done. The only thing you'll accomplish by crossing this line is getting yourself killed. The ground is energized. It's called step potential. Do you know what that is?" The question hung in the air, a direct challenge not to Miller's authority, but to his knowledge. It was a teacher's question, not a cop's, and it visibly pricked Miller's ego. He saw it as an attempt to belittle him in front of his partner and the firefighters from Engine 12, who were now watching the exchange with stony expressions. "I know my job," Miller snapped, his voice tight, "and it doesn't involve getting a lecture from the fire department." Evans shifted his weight, a clear sign of discomfort. "Kyle, let's just hold back," he said in a low voice. "The man's right. That's a utility issue. Let them handle it. We can run traffic at the intersection." Miller ignored him. His focus was locked on Ramirez. The situation had morphed in his mind. It was no longer about a downed power line. It was a contest of wills, a test of who was in command. In his world, the man with the badge and the gun was always in command. He felt the weight of his sidearm on his hip, a familiar and reassuring pressure. It was the ultimate symbol of his authority, an authority he felt was being publicly questioned. Ramirez recognized the look in the young deputy's eyes. It was the same look he'd seen on rookies who rushed into a burning building without checking the integrity of the floor, driven by adrenaline and a misguided sense of invincibility. It was a look that often preceded a Mayday call. "This isn't about your job or my job, Deputy," Ramirez said, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more direct. "This is about physics. 12,000 volts don't care what uniform you're wearing. It doesn't recognize your badge. It will kill you just as fast as it will kill anyone else. The perimeter is not moving. You are not crossing this tape. It's that simple." The finality in Ramirez's tone was absolute. He wasn't arguing anymore. He was stating an immutable fact, as unchangeable as gravity. For Miller, this was the final insult. He felt his face flush with anger. He felt the eyes of the neighbors, his partner, and the firefighters on him. He felt his authority slipping away, being usurped by a man who, in his view, was supposed to be a subordinate on a law enforcement scene. "We'll see about that," Miller muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. He took a deliberate step forward, his hand reaching for the plastic tape. Ramirez's body tensed. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a threat. He simply shifted his stance, planting his feet and becoming a physical barrier. He was taller than Miller and had 50 pounds of muscle and gear on him. He was an immovable object of reason standing against a misguided force of ego. "I'm not going to tell you again, Deputy," Ramirez said, his voice now cold and hard as steel. "Back away from the line." The challenge had been issued and refused. The professional boundary had been breached. Evans saw it happening, a slow-motion catastrophe of pissing contests and bruised pride. "Miller, for God's sake, stop," he pleaded, but his words were lost in the charged air. Deputy Miller's hand closed around the yellow tape. He looked at Ramirez, a smirk playing on his lips. It was a smirk that said, "You have no authority over me." He was about to learn, in the most public and permanent way possible, just how wrong he was. The confrontation had passed a point of no return. It was no longer a disagreement over procedure. It was a direct challenge to a lawful order in an emergency situation, and the consequences were about to become very real and very severe. The yellow tape was more than just a piece of plastic. In the world of emergency services, it was a sacred boundary, a universally understood symbol of mortal danger. It was a line drawn by experts to separate the safe from the lethal. For Deputy Kyle Miller to put his hands on it in defiance of a direct order from the scene commander was a profound breach of protocol, a slap in the face to the very concept of interagency respect. Captain Ramirez watched Miller's hand tighten on the tape. He could see the deputy's knuckles turn white. It was a small detail, but it told Ramirez everything he needed to know. This wasn't a calculated risk. It was an emotional reaction. Miller was operating from a place of pure ego. "Let go of the tape, Deputy." Ramirez's voice was dangerously quiet. "You're creating a hazard for my men and for yourself. This is a lawful order in an emergency incident zone. You are required to comply." He was giving Miller an out, a chance to de-escalate, framing it in the language of law and regulation that a cop should understand. He was appealing to the professional, hoping to bypass the prideful man. But Miller was too far gone. He heard the words "lawful order" not as a statement of fact, but as an escalation of the challenge. "The only lawful orders I follow come from the sheriff's department," Miller retorted, his voice rising. "You're interfering with a law enforcement investigation." "What investigation?" Ramirez asked, his tone laced with disbelief. "The only crime here is what that power line will do to you if you get any closer. I'm going to explain this one last time. So listen carefully. The electricity from that wire is bleeding into the ground. It creates a voltage gradient. Think of it like ripples in a pond. But the ripples are invisible, and they can stop your heart. If you take one step in there, and another step a few feet away, your body becomes a bridge between two different voltage points. The current will pass through your legs and torso. Your muscles will contract. You'll fall, and you'll lie there convulsing until your heart cooks inside your chest. My men and I will have to stand here and watch you die, because we can't come in to get you. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" It was a graphic, brutal, and technically precise explanation of the physics of death. It was designed to shock Miller back to reality, to make him understand that this was not a game. For a moment, it seemed to work. Miller's grip on the tape loosened slightly. He glanced at the innocuous-looking cable lying on the asphalt. Doubt flickered in his eyes. His partner, Evans, seized the opportunity. "He's right. Kyle," Evans said, stepping forward and putting a hand on Miller's shoulder. "This is insane. Let's back off. We can call the sergeant and let him know the situation. There's no reason for us to be in there." It was the right thing to say, but it came at exactly the wrong time. Miller, already feeling belittled by Ramirez, now felt undermined by his own partner. He shook off Evans's hand angrily. The flicker of doubt was extinguished, replaced by a renewed flash of defiance. He saw two men questioning his judgment, his authority. "I'm not standing down," Miller said through clenched teeth. "This road needs to be cleared." He turned his glare back to Ramirez. "You're obstructing me from performing my duties. That's a crime, Captain." Ramirez felt a sense of weary disbelief wash over him. He had dealt with panicked civilians, intoxicated drivers, and delirious victims who were easier to reason with. This deputy was willfully blind to the danger, so fixated on a perceived slight to his authority that he was willing to risk his life and force a confrontation that was spiraling out of control. "The only thing I'm obstructing is your path to the morgue," Ramirez said flatly. "This conversation is over. Step back behind my engine now, or I will have you removed from the scene." That was the breaking point. The word removed struck a nerve deep in Miller's psyche. He wasn't someone who got removed. He was the one who did the removing. He saw Ramirez's statement as a direct, physical threat. In his mind, the fire captain had just crossed the final line. "You'll have me removed?" Miller repeated, his voice a low, dangerous snarl. "You have no authority to remove me from anywhere." He let go of the yellow tape and took a half step toward Ramirez, puffing out his chest. His hand drifted down, coming to rest near the grip of his service pistol. It wasn't a move to draw the weapon, but it was an unmistakable gesture of intimidation, a non-verbal reminder of who had the ultimate power in a roadside confrontation. Ramirez didn't flinch. He didn't even glance at the gun. His eyes stayed locked on Miller's. "On an active fire or rescue scene, I have absolute authority over the operational area. That's established by state law and county protocol. You are in my operational area, and you are creating a safety risk. You are the one who is out of line here. Deputy?" The firefighters of Engine 12, Diaz and Martinez, had subtly repositioned themselves. They stood a few feet behind their captain, their expressions grim. They weren't armed, but their presence was a silent statement of solidarity. They were a team, and their captain was being challenged. "That's it," Miller said, his voice dripping with venom. "I've had enough of this. You're preventing me from doing my job. You are officially obstructing a peace officer." He looked at Evans. "Cuff him." The words hung in the air, so absurd, so profoundly wrong, that for a second, no one moved. Evans stared at his partner as if he had just started speaking in a foreign language. "Kyle, what are you talking about? You can't arrest a fire captain on his own scene for doing his job." But Miller wasn't listening to reason anymore. He was on a runaway train of his own making. "I just gave you an order. Deputy, are you going to follow it? Or are you obstructing too?" The threat was clear. With his judgment clouded by rage and ego, Deputy Kyle Miller was about to make a career-ending, life-altering mistake, and he was determined to drag his partner down with him. The uncrossable yellow line had been ignored, and now a far more dangerous line was about to be crossed. The order to arrest Captain Ramirez landed with the force of a physical blow. Deputy Evans stared at his partner, his mind struggling to process the sheer insanity of the command. They were standing in a designated hot zone, in front of a dozen civilian witnesses and a crew of firefighters, and Miller wanted to arrest the one person who was trying to keep them all alive. "Kyle, you've lost your mind," Evans said, his voice a harsh whisper. "We are so far outside the lines of policy right now, we can't even see them anymore. Look at this situation. We will be crucified." He was pleading, trying to pull his partner back from the brink. He knew with absolute certainty that this was a disaster. The paperwork alone would be a nightmare, a cascade of internal affairs investigations, interdepartmental grievances, and almost certainly a lawsuit. But Miller's face was a mask of grim determination. He saw Evans's hesitation not as a voice of reason, but as insubordination. I'm not asking you, Evans. I'm telling you. He is obstructing. He has failed to comply with a lawful order. He threatened to have me removed. That is grounds for arrest. Now, do your job. Ramirez, who had remained silent during the exchange between the two deputies, finally spoke. His voice was devoid of anger or fear. It was the voice of a man who had been pushed to the edge of his professional patience and found it was made of solid steel. Deputy Miller, he said, his tone making the name sound like an indictment. Let me be very clear. If you attempt to lay a hand on me or any of my crew, I will consider it an assault. We are engaged in an active emergency operation. Your actions are reckless. They are endangering the public, and they are illegal. You are the one breaking the law here, not me. Stand down. Now. He was building a record. Every word was precise, chosen for the inevitable report, and the body cameras he knew were recording. He knew this moment would be dissected frame by frame, and he was giving the investigators a clear, unambiguous narrative of a professional being illegally threatened while performing his sworn duty. The ultimatum, however, had the opposite effect on Miller. He felt cornered, and like a cornered animal, he lashed out. That's it. You're under arrest for obstruction of a government function and resisting an officer. His voice was loud now, playing to the small crowd that was watching, trying to project an authority he no longer truly possessed. He unclipped the handcuffs from his belt. The metallic snap echoed in the tense silence. Don't do it, son, Ramirez warned, his voice low and final. Miller ignored him. He turned to his partner, his eyes blazing. Evans, get his other arm, now! Evans was frozen. He was caught in an impossible position. He could refuse a direct order from his partner in the field, an act that could have its own professional consequences, or he could participate in an arrest he knew was patently unlawful and wrong. He saw his career, his pension, his future, all hanging in the balance because of Kyle Miller's fragile ego. In that moment of hesitation, he made the choice that would define the rest of his professional life. He chose the path of least immediate resistance. He chose to follow a bad order. With a look of profound regret on his face, he slowly moved toward Ramirez's other side. The firefighters, Diaz and Martinez, took a step forward in unison. A low growl of protest rumbled from Diaz's chest. Captain, he asked, his hands clenched into fists. It was a question. What are your orders? Ramirez gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. Stand down. He knew that if his men got involved, the situation would explode. It would become a brawl between cops and firefighters, a jurisdictional nightmare that would land them all in a world of trouble. Regardless of who was right, he had to contain the damage, and he had to trust that the system, as flawed as it was, would ultimately vindicate him. The cameras were rolling. That was his ace in the hole. I am not resisting, Ramirez said clearly. For the benefit of every recording device on the street, he slowly raised his hands, palms open, to show he was not a threat. But I want it on record that this is an unlawful arrest. You have no probable cause, and you are acting with gross negligence. The statement was like a dagger to Miller. It was calm, professional, and legally precise. It was the statement of a man who was already thinking about the courtroom. Miller's anger surged, and he shoved Ramirez forward, grabbing his arm and twisting it behind his back with unnecessary force. Get your hands behind your back, he shouted. The physical act of putting a fire captain in handcuffs on an active emergency scene was a line that, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. It was a violation of every professional courtesy, every protocol, every ounce of common sense. The crowd of neighbors gasped. One of them, A man who had been filming the entire exchange on his smartphone held it up higher, ensuring he captured every detail. As Miller fumbled with the handcuffs, his hands shaking slightly with adrenaline and rage, Captain Ramirez looked over his shoulder, his eyes meeting those of his crew. He saw their shock, their anger, their disbelief. His gaze was steady. It conveyed a simple, silent message. Document everything. Stay professional. The truth will come out. Authority wasn't something you could declare. It was something you earned. It was forged in the heat of countless fires, in the quiet confidence of expertise, and in the unwavering commitment to protecting lives. Deputy Miller thought the steel on his belt gave him authority. He was about to learn that real authority was forged in a different kind of fire, and the man he was putting in handcuffs had been tempered by it for 20 years. The metallic click of the handcuffs closing around Mike Ramirez's wrists was not the sound of justice. It was the sound of a career ending. But it wasn't the captain's. The click of the steel ratcheting shut around Captain Ramirez's wrists was a definitive, sickening sound. It sliced through the humid air, louder than the hum of the power line, more jarring than the hiss of the sparking cable. It was the sound of a boundary being shattered, not a yellow plastic one, but an invisible, critical one built on mutual respect between first responders. In that single moment, Deputy Kyle Miller transformed a tense but manageable scene into a full-blown crisis. Ramirez didn't struggle. He stood perfectly still as Miller cinched the cuffs tight, the cold metal biting into his skin. Years of training had taught him discipline, the ability to remain calm in the heart of chaos. He knew that resisting now, even justifiably, would only complicate things. The video was his witness. It would speak for him more eloquently than any protest could. He focused on his breathing, a slow, controlled rhythm, even as a surge of cold fury coursed through him. He was a fire captain, the commander of an active emergency scene, and he was being treated like a common criminal for doing his job. Deputy Evans, his face pale and slick with sweat, held Ramirez's other arm with a reluctant grip. He avoided making eye contact with anyone, not Ramirez, not his partner, and certainly not the firefighters of Engine 12, whose faces were now masks of cold, controlled rage. Evans knew he had just become complicit in a monumental screw-up. He could feel the weight of a dozen phone cameras on him, their lenses like tiny, accusing eyes. "Turn him around," Miller ordered, his voice still high on a wave of adrenaline. He gave Ramirez a slight shove toward the patrol car. "You're being transported to the county jail for processing." Diaz and Martinez watched, their powerlessness a galling, bitter pill. Their captain, their leader, a man they trusted with their lives, was being led away in handcuffs. Their training screamed at them to intervene, to protect their officer. But Ramirez's silent order to stand down held them in check. They exchanged a look. Martinez subtly angled his body, ensuring his own body-worn camera had a clear, unobstructed view of the entire pathetic spectacle. Diaz pulled out his department-issued cell phone and began recording, creating another layer of evidence. They were firefighters. Documentation was part of their DNA. "What's the charge?" Ramirez asked, his voice steady as he was walked toward the cruiser. He wasn't asking for himself. He was asking for the record. "Obstruction of a governmental function," Miller recited, the words sounding hollow and rehearsed. "And resisting, delaying, or obstructing a peace officer." "I did not resist. I did not delay. And the only thing I obstructed was your attempt to commit suicide by electrocution." Ramirez stated calmly and clearly. Every word was a nail in Miller's professional coffin. As Miller reached for the handle of his cruiser's back door, a new sound cut through the tension, the chirp of a different kind of siren, followed by the authoritative blast of an air horn. A black sheriff's department SUV was approaching at speed, its lights flashing. It wasn't running code for the downed wire. It was running code for a different kind of emergency. It was the field sergeant's vehicle. Someone, likely Sam Jones, the quick-thinking engineer on Engine 12, had gotten on the radio and escalated the situation up the chain of command on both sides. The SUV screeched to a halt behind Miller's cruiser. The door flew open and out stepped Sergeant Frank Brody, a 25-year veteran with salt and pepper hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. Brody was old school. He believed in chain of command, protocol, and, above all, common sense. His eyes took in the scene in a fraction of a second. The downed line, the fire engine, the yellow tape, the crowd of onlookers, and the absolutely unbelievable sight of a fire captain in full turnout gear, standing in handcuffs between two of his deputies. Brody's face went from concerned to thunderous in an instant. He didn't speak. He just started walking toward them, his strides long and purposeful. The look in his eyes was one of pure, unadulterated fury. Miller saw him coming. A flicker of uncertainty, the first crack in his armor of self-righteousness, appeared on his face. He had created this mess, and now a superior officer was here to see it in all its glory. "Sarge, the situation is under control," Miller began, trying to project confidence. "This individual was obstructing our investigation and refused to comply with lawful orders." Brody didn't even look at him. His eyes were locked on the steel cuffs around Ramirez's wrists. He stopped directly in front of the trio, his presence radiating an aura of absolute command that made Miller's earlier posturing look childish by comparison. "What?" Brody said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that promised dire consequences. "In the hell is this?" He looked from the cuffs to Miller's face, then to Evans's, who looked like he wanted the energized ground to open up and swallow him whole. "Sarge, he threatened me." Miller started again. "Shut up! Miller!" Brody snapped, cutting him off. His voice was like a whip crack. "Just shut your mouth. You have the right to remain silent. I strongly suggest you use it." He turned his gaze to Ramirez. He didn't know the captain personally, but he knew the uniform and the rank. He saw the calm professionalism in the man's eyes, even as he stood there humiliated. "Captain," Brody said, his tone shifting from fury to weary respect, "I'm Sergeant Frank Brody. Are you injured?" "I am not, Sergeant," Ramirez replied. "But your deputies have illegally detained me and abandoned a public safety emergency to do so." Brody's jaw worked silently for a moment. He looked at the dangling power line, then back at the cuffs. He knew, with the kind of gut certainty that came from decades on the job, that he was standing in the middle of the biggest departmental disaster he had seen in years. This was not just a mistake. It was a scandal in the making, recorded on a dozen cameras. He turned back to Miller, his eyes cold as ice. "Give me the key," he commanded. It wasn't a request. Miller hesitated for a fraction of a second, a final, pathetic attempt to cling to the authority he thought he had. "Now, deputy," Brody snarled. With trembling fingers, Deputy Miller retrieved the handcuff key from his belt and handed it to his sergeant. The transfer of that small piece of metal was a transfer of power, a symbol of the end of Miller's brief, disastrous reign of command on Oak Creek Drive. The click of the handcuffs opening would be the first step in a long, painful, and very public reckoning. The sound of the handcuffs unlocking was as significant as the sound of them closing. Sergeant Brody worked the key with a practiced efficiency, freeing Captain Ramirez's wrists. He didn't apologize, not yet. It wasn't the time or place. His first priority was to regain control of a scene that had devolved into chaos and to begin the long, arduous process of damage control. Ramirez brought his hands forward, rubbing the red, chafed marks the steel had left on his skin. He didn't say a word. He simply met Brody's eyes with a steady, professional gaze. An understanding passed between the two veterans. Brody knew his deputies had screwed up on a colossal scale. Ramirez knew that Brody was the first sign of sanity, the arrival of reason in a situation that had been driven by ego. Brody turned to Miller and Evans, his face a thundercloud of controlled rage. "You too," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Go sit in your car. Do not talk to each other. Do not talk on the radio. Do not touch your computers. Do you understand me?" "But Sarge," Miller started, a desperate attempt to explain himself, to justify the unjustifiable. "Did you not understand the words I just said? Deputy?" Brody's voice dropped even lower, becoming a venomous hiss. "Go to your car now." Defeated, humiliated, and for the first time, visibly scared. Miller turned and walked to the cruiser, Evans following like a man being led to the gallows. The swagger was gone, replaced by the shuffling gait of a man who was beginning to comprehend the depth of the hole he had just dug for himself. With his deputies sidelined, Brody turned his full attention back to Ramirez. "Captain, on behalf of the Sheriff's Department, I can't even begin to tell you how far off the rails this has gone. Are you willing to give me a brief rundown of what happened before I call my lieutenant?" Before Ramirez could answer, another vehicle arrived on scene. It was a red fire department SUV, the battalion chief's command vehicle. It parked behind engine 12, and out stepped a man with white hair and a gold badge that identified him as Battalion Chief Daniel Wallace. Wallace was built like a retired linebacker and had a reputation for being fiercely protective of his crews and having zero tolerance for bureaucratic nonsense. Sam Jones's radio call had clearly worked its way up the chain on the fireside as well. Wallace's eyes, like Brody's, immediately took in the impossible tableau, his senior captain rubbing his wrists while a sheriff's sergeant stood nearby, and two deputies sequestered in their patrol car like misbehaving children. He strode over, his face grim. "Mike, what the hell is going on here?" Wallace demanded, his gaze sweeping from Ramirez to Brody. "I got a call about a law enforcement issue involving my engine company. I see the issue." Ramirez gave his chief a quick, concise summary of the events, from establishing the perimeter to Miller's insistence on crossing it, culminating in the arrest. He spoke in the clipped, factual tone of an incident report, devoid of emotion, letting the facts themselves convey the outrage of the situation. As Ramirez spoke, Chief Wallace's face grew darker and darker. He looked at Sergeant Brody. "Sergeant, did your deputy really put my captain in handcuffs for establishing a safety zone around a live wire?" Brody could only nod, his expression weary. "Chief, that appears to be the case. I arrived to find him in custody. I have removed the deputies from the scene, and they are pending my investigation." "Pending your investigation?" Wallace's voice was sharp. "Sergeant, your deputy committed a criminal act. He assaulted a public servant, illegally detained him, and willfully interfered with an emergency operation. This isn't a matter for an internal review. This is a felony. I want them arrested. My captain is the victim of a crime." The demand hung in the air. A fire chief was demanding the arrest of two sheriff's deputies. The situation had escalated yet again, from a street-level dispute to a command-level confrontation. Brody ran a hand over his face. He knew Wallace was, technically, correct. The elements of the crime were all there. But arresting his own deputies on the scene, in front of everyone, the fallout would be cataclysmic. "Chief, I understand your anger. I'm just as angry as you are. But we have to follow a process. I need to get statements. I need to review the body camera footage. I need to get the district attorney's office involved." "The process?" Wallace shot back, his voice dripping with scorn. "Did your deputies follow a process when they chose to ignore 20 years of training and a half-dozen state laws to arrest a man for protecting them from their own stupidity? The process was broken the moment those cuffs came out." Ramirez stepped in, placing a calming hand on his chief's arm. "Chief, let the sergeant handle it for now," he said quietly. "It's all on camera. Every word, every action. Let the evidence do the talking." He looked at Brody. "I want to press charges. I want a formal complaint filed with your Internal Affairs Division, and I want a copy of every report and every second of video associated with this incident. My rights were violated, my duty was impeded, and my safety and the safety of my crew were compromised by the reckless actions of your deputies." It was a formal declaration of war, delivered with the calm precision of a surgeon. Brody nodded again. He knew this was just the beginning. The lawsuit was coming. The media storm was coming. The political fallout was coming. His department was about to be dragged through the mud. All because a young deputy with an ego couldn't stand being told no by a fire captain. "You'll get it all, Captain," Brody promised. "I will personally walk the complaint into the IA commander's office myself." He glanced over at the patrol car, where Miller and Evans sat in stony silence. He keyed his own radio. "Dispatch, I need a second unit to my location. Non-emergency. And have Lieutenant Morrison give me a call on my cell. Immediately." The call to the lieutenant was the next step up the ladder. The request for a second unit was a clear sign. Miller and Evans weren't going to be driving themselves back to the station. They were being relieved of duty. Right here. Right now. In the most public way possible. The arrival of Sergeant Brody hadn't ended the incident. It had just professionalized the disaster. Reason had arrived, and it was about to bring the full weight of the system down on the two men who had abandoned it. The arrival of Battalion Chief Wallace and the subsequent demand for the deputy's arrest had transformed the scene's command structure. It was no longer a simple operational matter. It was now a high-level administrative and potentially criminal crisis. Sergeant Brody found himself caught between the righteous fury of a sister agency's chief and the cold, hard reality of departmental procedure. "Chief Wallace, Captain Ramirez," Brody said, his voice strained but professional. "I can't make an arrest on your say-so, as much as I might want to. You know that. It has to go through the proper channels. But what I can do, and what I am doing, is removing these deputies from service effective immediately. They will be escorted back to headquarters. Their firearms will be secured, and they will be placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of a full internal and external investigation." It was the most he could offer at that moment, a promise of swift administrative justice. Wallace, though still visibly angry, seemed to accept this as a necessary first step. His focus was on protecting his captain and ensuring the incident was not swept under the rug. "Fine. Sergeant," Wallace conceded, his tone still sharp. "But I want your personal assurance that this won't get buried in some IA file for 6 months. I'm calling the fire chief as soon as I leave here." "He will be calling the sheriff. This is going to the top. Today." "I wouldn't expect anything less," Brody said grimly. He knew the call from chief to sheriff was inevitable. It was the nuclear option in interdepartmental disputes, a conversation that would be happening between two of the most powerful people in the county. Just then, Brody's cell phone rang. He glanced at the caller ID. Lieutenant Morrison, his immediate superior. He stepped away a few feet, turning his back for a semblance of privacy. "Yeah. Lieutenant. No, it's worse than you think. Yes. A fire captain. In cuffs. No, he was the scene commander. I know. I'm on it. While Brody was on the phone, Wallace turned to Ramirez. Are you okay, Mike? And I don't mean physically. I'm fine. Chief, Ramirez said, though a muscle in his jaw was twitching. Just angry. They put the entire scene at risk. If one of my guys had reacted, if a civilian had tried to intervene, Miller's ego could have gotten people killed today, and not just from the power line. I know, Wallace said, clapping a hand on his captain's shoulder. You handled it by the book. You showed incredible restraint. You let him bury himself, and you made sure the cameras were rolling while he did it. You did good. Coming from the notoriously tough Chief Wallace, it was high praise. The second sheriff's cruiser pulled up. The deputy behind the wheel, a sober-faced woman in her late 40s, took one look at the situation and her expression tightened. She knew this was not a standard call. Brody ended his call with the lieutenant and walked over to her. He spoke in a low voice, but the instructions were clear. She was to transport deputies Miller and Evans back to the main station. They were to be taken directly to an interview room at the Internal Affairs Division and were to wait there. Their patrol car would be impounded as evidence. A few minutes later, the humiliating process began. Miller and Evans were instructed to get out of their car. Brody himself took their sidearms, unloading them with practiced movements before placing them in evidence bags. He took their car keys. He took their radios. In the span of 5 minutes, they were stripped of every symbol of their authority. Miller's face was ashen. His earlier arrogance completely evaporated, replaced by the dawning horror of his situation. Evans just looked numb, his eyes vacant. They got into the back of the second cruiser without a word. As it pulled away, it felt like a funeral procession for 2 careers. With the deputies gone, a semblance of normalcy returned to the scene. The utility company's bucket truck finally arrived, its yellow warning lights adding to the kaleidoscope of flashing colors. A lineman in a hard hat and heavy rubber gloves got out and conferred with Ramirez, who, despite the ordeal, seamlessly transitioned back into his role as scene commander. He briefed the lineman on the situation, pointing out the location of the downed cable. Brody and Wallace watched from the sidewalk. The clash of chiefs was over, replaced by a somber alliance. They were 2 senior commanders from different agencies, now united by a common problem: a catastrophic failure of judgment by a law enforcement officer. He's a good man, your captain, Brody said, breaking the silence. One of the best, Wallace replied. Calm under pressure, knows his job inside and out. The last person on earth who deserves this kind of treatment. My lieutenant is meeting me at the station, Brody continued, running a hand through his hair. The sheriff has already been notified. He's displeased. That's the official term. Unofficially, he's volcanic. Brody sighed. The body cam footage. That's what this is all going to come down to. My lieutenant wants it pulled and uploaded to the command staff server before we even interview Miller. Good, Wallace said. The sooner your bosses see what really happened, the better. He looked at Ramirez, who was now directing his crew to begin retrieving their equipment. Their job on the scene nearly done. I'm taking the captain back to headquarters myself. We'll be writing our own reports. And our report will include a recommendation to the district attorney for a full criminal investigation. The lines were drawn. The sheriff's department would conduct its internal investigation, desperate to control the narrative and clean its own house. The fire department, feeling betrayed and protective of its own, would be pushing for an outside criminal probe. And in the middle of it all was the objective. Unblinking eye of the body cameras. The digital evidence that would render all opinions and internal politics irrelevant. The showdown on Oak Creek Drive was over, but the battle for accountability was just beginning, as the utility crew began the dangerous work of de-energizing and repairing the downed line. The emergency phase of the incident drew to a close. Captain Ramirez conducted a final walkthrough with his crew, ensuring all their equipment was accounted for. The yellow tape was still up, but it would soon be taken down. The street returned to its sleepy, suburban quiet. But for everyone involved in the confrontation, the quiet was deceptive. A storm of a different kind was brewing. Chief Wallace escorted Ramirez back to his command vehicle. "Mike, you're done for the day," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Go home. Decompress. I want your report by tomorrow morning, but not before you've had a chance to clear your head. Write down every single thing you remember, every word that was said. Be meticulous." "I will, Chief," Ramirez said. He felt a profound sense of exhaustion setting in, the adrenaline from the confrontation finally giving way to a bone-deep weariness. It wasn't the physical toll of the job, but the mental and emotional weight of what had just happened. "And Mike," Wallace added, his expression serious. "Don't talk to anyone about this, not the media, not anyone from the sheriff's department. If they call, you refer them to me or the city attorney's office. From this point forward, everything goes through official channels." It was a clear sign that the incident had already entered the legal phase. Across the street, Sergeant Brody was conducting his own final procedures. He spoke with the man who had been filming the incident on his smartphone, getting his name and contact information. "Sir, would you be willing to provide a copy of that video to the sheriff's department for our investigation?" Brody asked. "Absolutely," the man said eagerly. "I've got the whole thing." That deputy was way out of line. He was now a civilian witness. His video another piece of corroborating evidence. Brody then walked over to the firefighters of Engine 12. "Gentlemen," he said respectfully, "I'll need your names and badge numbers. An investigator from our Internal Affairs Division will likely be contacting you for a statement." Diaz, his face still set in a grim line, simply pointed to his helmet shield and his chest. "It's all right here, Sergeant. And my body cam was on the whole time. So was his." He jerked a thumb at Martinez. They were making it clear. Their testimony wasn't just their word, it was recorded, time-stamped, and irrefutable. This was the new reality of modern policing and emergency response. Every significant event was captured from multiple angles. There was the official record from the body-worn cameras, the dash cams from the patrol cars and fire engines, and the unofficial, often damning, record from the cell phone of every citizen who happened to be nearby. An unseen, silent, and completely objective witness was always present. Back at the sheriff's department headquarters, a sterile, modern building miles away from Oak Creek Drive. Lieutenant Morrison was waiting in his office. He had already spoken to the sheriff. The orders were clear. Take direct control of the investigation, bypass the usual chain of command, and get the digital evidence secured above all else. When Sergeant Brody arrived, he found the lieutenant pacing. "Frank, tell me this is just a massive misunderstanding," Morrison said. Though his tone suggested he already knew the answer, "It's a complete catastrophe." "Mark," Brody replied, sinking into a chair. He gave the lieutenant the unvarnished truth, recounting the entire sordid affair. He ended with the most critical piece of information. "It's all on video, Miller's body cam, Evans's, the 2 firefighters, and at least 1 civilian. There's no ambiguity here." Morrison's face was grim. "The sheriff wants to see it. Now." He picked up his desk phone. "This is Morrison. I want the body camera footage from Deputies Miller and Evans. Incident number 2, 023-7491, pulled from the server immediately. Download the RAW. unedited files and bring them to the sheriff's conference room on a secure drive. And I want the evidence technicians to start the process of formally requesting the footage from the fire department. Tell them we are treating this as a high-priority internal investigation. The order set in motion a critical process. The digital files, which had been automatically uploaded from the deputies' cameras the moment they were placed in their charging docks at the station, were now flagged. They were isolated on a secure server, creating a chain of custody. Any attempt to access, edit, or delete them would be digitally fingerprinted and tracked. The unseen witness was being formally entered into evidence. In an interview room down the hall, Miller and Evans sat in silence. Their careers had been built on their ability to collect evidence, to write reports, take statements, and testify to what they had seen. Now, they were on the other side of the equation. The most important piece of evidence in their case was the one they themselves had created: a digital recording of their own colossal failure in judgment. Miller was likely replaying the events in his head, trying to construct a narrative that would justify his actions. He would focus on Ramirez's tone, on the phrase, "Have you removed?" on his own subjective feeling of being obstructed. He would try to build a case for himself, but the unseen witness didn't have a subjective opinion. The camera didn't care about ego or perceived disrespect. It had simply recorded light and sound. It had captured the calm, professional tone of the fire captain. It had captured Miller's aggression, his escalation of the conflict. It had captured Evans's reluctant complicity. It had captured the clear, unambiguous physics lesson about the lethal danger they were in, a lesson that had been ignored. As the technician in the evidence lab clicked download, the fate of the two deputies was sealed. The truth was no longer a matter of he said. It was a matter of pressing play, and in a conference room on the top floor, the sheriff of the county was waiting to watch the show. The sheriff's conference room was a space designed for command and control. A long, polished mahogany table dominated the center, surrounded by high-backed leather chairs. At one end, a massive 80-inch screen was mounted on the wall, dark and silent. The air was thick with tension. Sheriff James Thompson, a man in his late 50s with a politician's practiced calm and a cop's weary eyes, sat at the head of the table. With him were his undersheriff, the captain in charge of patrol operations, and Lieutenant Morrison. Sergeant Brody stood near the door. Having just finished his verbal debrief, an evidence technician, a young woman with a serious expression, entered the room carrying a laptop and a secure hard drive. "Sheriff, I have the footage from Deputy Miller's body-worn camera, as requested," she said quietly. "Put it on the screen, please," Sheriff Thompson said, his voice flat. The technician connected the laptop to the room's AV system. A moment later, the screen flickered to life. The first image was blurry, a view of the patrol car's dashboard. Then it stabilized as Deputy Miller stepped out of his vehicle. The audio kicked in, a mix of radio static and the sound of his boots on the wet asphalt. The camera's perspective, mounted mid-chest, gave the viewers an unsettling first-person view of the unfolding disaster. They watched in silence as Miller approached the scene. They saw Engine 12, the yellow tape, the dangling wire. They heard Captain Ramirez's first words, clear, calm, and professional. "Afternoon, deputies. For your safety, I need you to stay back." The patrol captain shifted uncomfortably in his chair. It was textbook scene management from the fire captain. There was nothing aggressive or confrontational in his tone. Then they heard Miller's reply. "We need to assess the situation and get the road reopened." The tone was immediately different, challenging, dismissive. Sheriff Thompson's jaw tightened. He recognized the sound of a young deputy overplaying his hand. The room was silent as the video continued. They watched the exchange escalate. They saw Ramirez point to the wire, heard his patient, clear explanation of step potential. It wasn't a lecture, it was a warning, an expert trying to prevent a tragedy. Then they heard Miller's retort. "I know my job. Pause the video," the sheriff commanded. The image froze on a close-up of the yellow tape. "So far?" Thompson said, his voice dangerously calm. "I see a fire captain doing his job correctly and a deputy with an attitude problem. Does anyone see anything different?" No one spoke. The undersheriff slowly shook his head. "Play it," Thompson ordered. The video resumed. They witnessed the entire excruciating confrontation. They heard Evans's attempts to de-escalate. "Kyle, let's just hold back. This is insane." They heard Miller's voice rising in anger, his accusation of obstruction. They saw, from Miller's own perspective, Captain Ramirez stand his ground, his hands open, his voice firm but controlled as he cited state law and county protocol. Then came the critical moment. They heard Miller's declaration, "You're under arrest." A collective, soft intake of breath went around the room. It was one thing to hear it described by Brody. It was another to see and hear it happen, recorded by the man making the arrest. They watched as the camera lurched forward when Miller shoved the captain. They saw Ramirez's hands being pulled behind his back. They heard the final, damning click of the handcuffs. The sheriff held up a hand. "Stop!" The video froze again, this time on the image of Ramirez's back. The letters F.D., Captain on his turnout coat perfectly framed. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the heavy, oppressive silence of a scandal breaking. The video was irrefutable. It was a clear-cut case of a deputy letting his ego run wild, escalating a simple jurisdictional issue into an unlawful arrest and a major interagency incident. There was no ambiguity, no gray area. Miller's own camera had become the primary witness for his prosecution. "What was Miller's justification for this?" the sheriff asked, his voice barely a whisper. He wasn't really asking a question. He was thinking out loud, trying to fathom the catastrophic lapse in judgment. "He claimed the captain threatened to have him removed," Lieutenant Morrison supplied. "The captain was right," the sheriff snapped, his voice suddenly hard. "As scene commander in a life safety incident, he does have the authority to remove anyone who poses a risk, including a deputy." Miller wasn't obstructed. He was being insubordinate to the lawful commander of an emergency scene. The entire arrest is predicated on a false understanding of the law. He looked around the table, his gaze lingering on each of his commanders. "This is not going away," he said, his voice low and intense. "The fire chief has already called me. He used the words criminal assault and gross negligence. He's not wrong. The mayor's office has called me. They saw a video of the arrest on social media before I even saw this footage. We are behind the 8 ball. The mention of social media sent another chill through the room. The citizen's video was already out there, shaping the public narrative. "Get me the file on Miller," the sheriff ordered the patrol captain. "I want to see every use of force report, every citizen complaint, every performance review he's ever had. I want to know if this is a pattern or a one-time implosion." He turned to Morrison. "Tell Internal Affairs to get his formal statement, and then get Evans's statement separately. I want to see if their stories match each other. And more importantly, if they match this video." He gestured at the frozen image on the screen. "That," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of anger and disgust, "is the only story I'm interested in. The one the camera is telling." The first playback was over. The command staff had seen the raw, ugly truth. There would be no defending Deputy Miller's actions. There would be no spinning this. There would only be consequences. The unseen witness had testified, and its testimony was brutal, concise, and absolute. The only question left was how to manage the fallout. while Sheriff Thompson and his command staff were watching the unvarnished truth. Deputy Kyle Miller was sitting in a sterile, windowless interview room in the Internal Affairs suite, crafting a work of fiction. He had been given a laptop and instructed by a stone-faced IA sergeant to type a full, detailed incident report. It was his opportunity to frame the narrative, to present his version of events before anyone else could. It was his chance to save his career. He started with the dispatch call, establishing a tone of routine police work. He described arriving on scene and observing the traffic hazard. He was meticulous with the small, irrelevant details, the make and model of the nearby cars, the weather conditions, the street names. It was a common tactic, build a foundation of mundane facts to make the subsequent inventions seem more plausible. Then he got to the heart of the matter, the confrontation with Captain Ramirez. Here, his language shifted. He described Ramirez as immediately confrontational and hostile. He wrote that the captain refused to allow law enforcement to secure the scene, a gross misrepresentation of Ramirez's attempts to ensure their safety. Captain Ramirez took an aggressive posture, he typed, and blocked my path to assess the full scope of the public hazard. He was dismissive of my authority as a sworn peace officer and stated that our presence was not required. He carefully omitted Ramirez's detailed explanation of step potential. He made no mention of the lethal danger he had been warned about. In Miller's version, the downed power line was merely a backdrop, a minor detail in a story that was all about a contest of authority. His report was transforming a life safety issue into a simple case of defiance. The most crucial part of his report was his justification for the arrest. He latched onto the one phrase he thought could save him. The captain then made a direct threat, stating he would have me removed from the scene. I interpreted this as a threat of physical force and an escalation of his noncompliance. He was actively and physically obstructing me from performing my official duties. His actions and his threatening language left me with no alternative but to effect an arrest for obstruction of a governmental function under Penal Code 148A. He portrayed himself as the calm professional, forced into a difficult decision by an uncooperative and threatening individual. He described the arrest as being conducted with minimal force and noted that the suspect was secured without incident. He was painting a picture of a textbook arrest, a difficult but necessary action taken to restore order. In a separate room down the hall, Deputy Evans was writing his own report. His was shorter, less detailed. He was walking a tightrope. He couldn't directly contradict his partner without accusing him of lying and making himself look insubordinate. But he also couldn't fully endorse Miller's fantasy without tying his own fate directly to that sinking ship. His report was a masterpiece of vague language and passive voice. Contact was made with the fire department captain on scene, Evans wrote. A disagreement over scene control occurred. The captain's instructions were not aligned with Deputy Miller's assessment. The situation escalated, resulting in the captain being taken into custody. It was a non-report. It confirmed an arrest happened but assigned no blame and offered no justification. It was the report of a man trying to become invisible, a man who knew the truth was on video and was desperately trying not to get caught in the crossfire between the official narrative and the recorded reality. When Miller finished his report, he read it over one last time. He likely believed it was a strong, defensible account. He had framed his actions within the language of the law. Using terms like officer safety and non-compliance, he had built his own reality, one where he was the hero of the story, the lone deputy holding the line against an out-of-control fire captain. He clicked Submit, sending the document into the department's records management system. His official story was now on the record. The problem for Miller was that his narrative now existed in a world where the body camera footage also existed. His report was a subjective, self-serving account. The video was objective truth, and the two were on a collision course. Upstairs. Lieutenant Morrison had just received a notification that Miller's report had been filed. He opened it on his computer, reading it on one screen while the body cam video played silently on another. He read Miller's description of a hostile and aggressive Ramirez, then looked at the video of the calm, professional captain trying to save the deputy's life. He read Miller's claim of being threatened, then watched the footage of Ramirez calmly explaining state law. He read the assertion that the arrest was made with minimal force, then saw the video of Miller unnecessarily shoving the captain. Morrison shook his head in disbelief. It wasn't just a different interpretation of events, it was a fabrication. Miller wasn't just guilty of a catastrophic error in judgment on the street. He was now guilty of filing a false police report, a fireable offense on its own. He had taken a terrible situation and made it exponentially worse. He had committed his lies to paper. The official narrative was a house of cards, and Lieutenant Morrison was holding a high-definition video that was about to blow it all down. Miller had been given a chance to tell the truth, to show remorse, to admit a mistake. Instead, he had doubled down on the lie. His report wasn't a life raft. It was an anchor, and it was about to drag him and his partner to the bottom. 2 days later, Deputy Kyle Miller sat in the same sterile interview room. This time, however, he wasn't alone. Across the table sat Sergeant Davis and Detective Chen from the Internal Affairs Division. Davis was a veteran investigator with a reputation for being methodical and unflappable. Chen was younger, a tech specialist who understood digital evidence better than anyone in the department. A high-fidelity audio recorder sat in the middle of the table, its small red light glowing. "Deputy Miller," Sergeant Davis began, her voice neutral. "This is a formal administrative interview regarding the incident on Oak Creek Drive. You are being ordered to answer our questions truthfully and completely as a condition of your employment. This is an administrative matter, not a criminal one. Do you understand?" This was the standard Garrity warning, compelling him to talk while protecting him from self-incrimination in a criminal case. It also meant that if he lied, he could be fired for insubordination. "I understand," Miller said, his voice tight. He sat stiffly in his chair, trying to project the same confidence he had shown on the street, but the effect was undermined by the dark circles under his eyes. "Walk us through the incident, from the moment you arrived on scene," Davis instructed. Miller recited the narrative from his report, almost word for word. He used the same loaded language, describing Captain Ramirez as confrontational and obstructive. He painted a picture of a scene commander who was actively preventing law enforcement from doing their job. He was sticking to his story, hoping that repetition would make it true. Davis let him finish without interruption, her expression unreadable. When he was done, she looked down at her notes. "Deputy, you stated that Captain Ramirez was hostile. Can you describe the specific words or actions you would classify as hostile?" "His tone," Miller said immediately. "He was condescending. He refused to cooperate. He physically blocked my path." Detective Chen, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "We have your body camera footage. Deputy, we've reviewed it several times. At what point in the video would you say the captain's tone becomes hostile?" Miller hesitated. From the beginning, he was immediately dismissive of our presence. "So, when he greeted you with afternoon deputies and warned you to stay back for your safety, you interpreted that as hostility?" Chen asked, his voice calm and inquisitive. "It was the way he said it," Miller insisted, starting to squirm. "He was challenging my authority." "Let's talk about the arrest," Sergeant Davis said, shifting gears. "Your report states that the captain threatened you. His exact words were, 'I will have you removed from the scene.' Is that correct?" "Yes. A direct threat. Are you familiar with County Ordinance 4.5.2 regarding command of an emergency scene? Davis asked. I'm familiar with the penal code. Miller deflected. The ordinance, Davis continued, ignoring his response, grants the senior fire officer on a fire or rescue scene full authority over the inner perimeter, including the authority to order the removal of any person, including a law enforcement officer, who is interfering with operations or creating a safety hazard. Are you telling us you were unaware of this ordinance? Miller's face went pale. He knew the ordinance existed, but he had never considered it would apply to him. He was obstructing our investigation. What investigation, Deputy? Chen cut in. There was no crime in progress. The only hazard was the downed wire, which the fire department was handling. What, specifically, were you investigating when you claimed the captain obstructed you? Miller had no answer. The flimsy pretext of checking on a parked car was too ridiculous to repeat in a formal interview. He stammered. The overall scene. Public safety. Captain Ramirez was the individual responsible for public safety at that moment, and you arrested him for it, Davis stated flatly. She leaned forward slightly. Deputy, your report makes no mention of Captain Ramirez's repeated warnings about step potential. He gave you a detailed explanation of how that wire could kill you. Why did you omit that from your official report? The question was a direct accusation of falsifying a report. Miller's composure finally cracked. I didn't think it was relevant to the obstruction charge. Not relevant, Chen said, his voice edged with disbelief. A scene commander warning you of a lethal threat isn't relevant to the context of your interaction? Or is it that including it would have made your subsequent actions seem unreasonable? The interview continued like that for another hour. A slow, methodical dissection of Miller's story. Every claim he made was immediately contrasted with the video and audio evidence. Every justification he offered was dismantled by questions about law and policy. Next, they brought in Deputy Evans. His interview was shorter. Evans, having had 2 days to reflect on his role in the fiasco, was far less combative. His story was a desperate attempt to minimize his own culpability. Did you believe you had probable cause to arrest Captain Ramirez? Davis asked him directly. Evans hesitated, his eyes darting around the room. Deputy Miller was the senior officer on that specific contact, he said, using procedural jargon to avoid a direct answer. I was following his lead. That's not what I asked. Deputy, Davis pressed. In your professional opinion, did the captain's actions rise to the level of a crime? Evans took a deep breath. He knew this was the moment of truth. He could continue to cover for his partner, or he could start saving himself. Looking back, probably not, he mumbled. The situation got heated. Mistakes were made. Was Deputy Miller's report, which you also signed, a true and accurate account of the events? Chen asked. Another long pause. It was Deputy Miller's perception of the events, Evans finally said. It was the closest he would come to calling his partner a liar. The investigators had everything they needed. They had Miller, trapped in a web of lies of his own making. They had his partner, who had all but admitted the arrest was bogus. And they had the video, the silent witness that condemned them both. The internal investigation was no longer about determining what happened. It was about documenting the failure and recommending the consequences. The story Miller had tried to write was dead. The only narrative that mattered now was the one being prepared for the sheriff's desk. And it was a story of ego, ignorance, and a stunning abuse of power. 1 week after the incident on Oak Creek Drive, Captain Mike Ramirez sat in a much different conference room. This one was on the 40th floor of a downtown skyscraper, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. The mahogany table was even more polished, the leather chairs even plusher. Across from him sat David Chen, a name that struck fear into the hearts of city attorneys and police departments across the state. Chen wasn't just a lawyer, he was a renowned civil rights attorney who specialized in suing law enforcement agencies for misconduct. He had a reputation for being brilliant, relentless, and extraordinarily expensive. Ramirez, dressed in a simple collared shirt and slacks, recounted the story for what felt like the 100th time. He spoke with the same calm, factual precision he had used from the beginning. Chief Wallace sat beside him, a silent show of support. When Ramirez finished, Chen, a sharp-dressed man in his early 50s, leaned back in his chair. He had a copy of Miller's police report on the table in front of him, next to a tablet queued up with the body camera footage. He had already reviewed everything. "Captain Ramirez," Chen began, his voice smooth and confident. "First, let me thank you for your service and commend you for your incredible professionalism under duress. What you experienced was not just wrong, it was a flagrant violation of your 4th and 14th Amendment rights. This wasn't an arrest. It was a kidnapping under the color of law." Chen tapped the police report with a pen. "This document is a gift. Deputy Miller didn't just wrongfully arrest you. He then lied about it in an official report. He created a false narrative to cover his tracks. The body camera footage completely refutes every material claim he makes. In the world of civil rights litigation, this is what we call a slam dunk." The county district attorney's office had already come to a similar conclusion. After reviewing the evidence package submitted by the Sheriff's Department's IA investigators, which now included the firefighter's body cam footage and the civilian cell phone video, they had issued a formal statement. They were not only declining to file any charges against Captain Ramirez, but they were also launching their own investigation into the deputies for potential criminal charges, including perjury and filing a false police report. That announcement had been the final green light for Ramirez. His name was officially cleared, but the damage had been done. His illegal arrest had been broadcast on the local news and circulated on social media. His authority had been publicly undermined. He had been humiliated for doing his job. "What are our options?" Ramirez asked, though he already knew the answer. "We file a federal civil rights lawsuit," Chen explained. "We'll name Deputy Miller and Deputy Evans as individual defendants. And we'll name the county and the Sheriff's Department as defendants as well. We're not just going after the officers, we're going after the department that trained them, supervised them, and is ultimately responsible for their actions." He continued, laying out the strategy. "The core of our claim will be unlawful arrest and violation of due process, but we'll add claims for intentional infliction of emotional distress, negligence, and malicious prosecution. The goal here isn't just to get you compensation, Captain. The goal is to send a message. We want to force systemic change in that department. We want this to be so painful for them that they will ensure a deputy never, ever thinks about pulling a stunt like this again." A few days later, a process server walked into the county council's office and dropped a thick legal document on the front desk. The lawsuit had been officially filed. The news spread like wildfire through both the fire and sheriff's departments. The numbers being discussed were staggering. Chen wasn't asking for a small settlement. He was demanding punitive damages on a scale the county had never seen before. The county's attorneys knew they were in an impossible position. They had a sympathetic and unimpeachable plaintiff, a decorated fire captain. They had 2 rogue deputies whose actions were indefensible. And most importantly, they had the video. There was no plausible defense strategy. They couldn't claim Miller acted in good faith. The video showed his anger and ego. They couldn't claim Ramirez was a threat. The video showed his calm professionalism. They couldn't argue the facts. The facts were recorded in high definition from 4 different angles. Their only option was to try and settle, to stanch the bleeding and avoid a public trial. They offered Ramirez a respectable six-figure sum to make it all go away quietly. David Chen's response was swift and brutal. He rejected the offer in a one-sentence letter. The message was clear. This wasn't about a quick payday. This was about accountability. He was taking them to trial. He wanted to put Deputy Miller on the stand. He wanted to play that video for a jury of 12 citizens. He knew that every time that jury saw the click of those handcuffs, the number in their heads would go up. The inevitable lawsuit had become an impending financial catastrophe for the county. For Ramirez, it was no longer just about the insult he had suffered on Oak Creek Drive. It was about standing up for every first responder who had ever been undermined, challenged, or disrespected while trying to do their job. The legal battle had been joined, and it was a battle the county had already lost. They just didn't know how badly yet. The filing of the federal lawsuit was the external manifestation of the crisis. Internally, the sheriff's department was in full meltdown. The IA investigation, which had begun as a fact-finding mission, had quickly transformed into a damage assessment. The final report, a 100-page document thick with transcripts, policy citations, and legal analysis, landed on Sheriff Thompson's desk with a heavy thud. Its conclusions were brutal and unambiguous. Finding number 1, Deputy Kyle Miller acted outside the scope of his training and authority. He failed to recognize the authority of the fire captain as the designated scene commander in a life safety incident. Finding number 2, the use of force, the shove and handcuffing on Captain Ramirez, was unreasonable and unnecessary. The captain was compliant and posed no physical threat. Finding number 3, the arrest of Captain Ramirez was without probable cause. No reasonable officer would have believed a crime had been committed. Finding number 4, Deputy Miller knowingly filed a false and misleading police report to justify his unlawful actions. Finding number 5, Deputy John Evans failed in his duty to intervene and stop a fellow officer from engaging in misconduct. He also signed his name to a report he knew to be incomplete and inaccurate. The report's recommendations were just as stark. For Deputy Evans, a lengthy suspension, a permanent mark on his record, and a mandatory transfer to a non-patrol position. For Deputy Kyle Miller, the recommendation was a single word: termination. Sheriff Thompson read the report twice. There was no joy in it, only a grim sense of duty. He had invested in Miller, seen him as a future leader, but the evidence was overwhelming. Miller's ego had become a liability the department could no longer afford. He summoned Miller and his union representative to his office. Kyle Miller walked into the sheriff's office looking like a changed man. The confidence was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed exhaustion. He had been on administrative leave for weeks, isolated at home, watching his name and face get dragged through the mud on the nightly news. He knew this meeting was the end of the line. The meeting was brief. Sheriff Thompson didn't mince words. He outlined the findings of the IA investigation, focusing on the most damning conclusion: the filing of the false report. "Deputy, you had an opportunity to tell the truth," Thompson said, his voice cold. "You could have owned your mistake. People make mistakes in this line of work. We can often fix mistakes. What we cannot fix, and what we will not tolerate, is dishonesty. Your report was a fabrication designed to cover up a wrongful arrest. You lied. That lie has exposed this department to massive civil and criminal liability. It has destroyed the trust between our agency and the fire department. It has destroyed your credibility as a peace officer. You can never testify in court again. Your career in law enforcement is over." Miller sat in silence, his union rep looking on grimly. There were no arguments to be made. The evidence was absolute. "Effective immediately. Your employment with the county sheriff's department is terminated." Thompson concluded. "I need your badge and your identification card." It was the final, irreversible moment of disgrace. With trembling hands, Miller reached into his wallet and pulled out his ID card. He then unclipped the gleaming silver badge from his belt. The badge he had worked so hard for, the symbol of the power and authority he had so thoroughly abused. He placed it on the polished surface of the sheriff's desk. The small metallic sound seemed to echo in the silent room. It was the sound of a career dying, without another word. Miller stood up and walked out of the office, a civilian for the first time in 5 years. The union rep could do nothing but shake his head and follow him out. The next day, the department issued a press release announcing Miller's termination for violations of department policy. They also announced Deputy Evans's suspension and reassignment. It was an attempt to show the public they were taking the matter seriously, but everyone knew it was too little, too late. The lawsuit was proceeding, and the damage was already done. Miller's termination also triggered another process. The Sheriff's Department sent a formal notification to the state's Peace Officer Standards and Training Post Board detailing the circumstances of his firing. The charge of official dishonesty was a cardinal sin in law enforcement. The Post Board initiated its own review to determine whether Miller's law enforcement certification should be permanently revoked, which would prevent him from ever working as a cop anywhere in the state again. The badge on the desk was more than just a piece of metal. It was a symbol of public trust. Kyle Miller had been given that trust, and he had broken it. He had let his pride and his temper get the better of him, and in a few short minutes on a rainy afternoon, he had thrown away his entire future. He was now just another citizen, stripped of his authority, facing a future defined by the catastrophic consequences of his own actions. The system had begun to purge itself, and the first casualty was the man who had started the entire debacle. 18 months after the incident on Oak Creek Drive, the case of Ramirez versus County of San Marcos, et al., finally went to trial. The county's lawyers had made several more attempts to settle, their offers climbing into the millions. But David Chen had rejected everyone. He had been adamant from the beginning. This case needed to be heard by a jury. He wanted the public humiliation of the sheriff's department to be complete. He wanted a verdict that would echo in every police department in the country. The courtroom was packed. On one side sat Mike Ramirez, looking stoic and professional in a dark suit, with Chief Wallace and several of his fellow firefighters sitting in the gallery behind him. On the other side sat a team of stressed-looking county attorneys. Kyle Miller and John Evans were also there, as named defendants, though they looked like shadows of their former selves. Miller had been unable to find work in law enforcement and was now selling insurance. Evans was finishing his suspension, assigned to a desk job in the records division, his career permanently stalled. David Chen's opening statement was a masterclass in narrative storytelling. He didn't talk about legal statutes or case law. He talked about duty, honor, and professionalism. He painted a vivid picture of Captain Ramirez, a dedicated public servant, doing his job, protecting the public, only to be assaulted and humiliated by an officer whose ego was more important than public safety. "This case," Chen said, his voice resonating through the courtroom, "is about a sacred trust, the trust between the public and law enforcement, and the trust between first responders who run toward danger together. On that day, Deputy Kyle Miller shattered that trust, and the evidence will show that he did it not for any legitimate law enforcement reason, but because of his own arrogance." When it was the county's turn, their lawyer did his best. He tried to frame the incident as a misunderstanding, a communication breakdown, in a chaotic environment. He argued that Deputy Miller had made a mistake in judgment, but that it didn't rise to the level of a constitutional violation. It was a weak argument, and everyone in the room knew it. The trial lasted for 5 days. Ramirez was the first to take the stand. He was a perfect witness, calm, credible, and precise. He walked the jury through the events of that day, never once raising his voice or showing anger. He explained the science of step potential, making the danger he was trying to prevent feel real and immediate. But the real star of the trial wasn't a person. It was the video footage. David Chen set up a large screen in the courtroom, visible to the judge, the jury, and everyone in the gallery. "Your Honor," he said, "I would now like to play the body camera footage from the defendant, former Deputy Kyle Miller." He played the entire, unedited video. The courtroom was completely silent, captivated by the raw, real-time drama unfolding on the screen. The jury watched with rapt attention. They saw Miller's aggressive approach. They heard Ramirez's calm warnings. They saw Ramirez's patient explanation of the danger. They saw Miller's dismissive attitude, his rising anger, his partner's pleas to de-escalate. And then they saw the arrest. The jurors flinched when the camera lurched forward as Miller shoved Ramirez. They leaned in, their faces tight with concentration, as they watched the fire captain being placed in handcuffs for doing his job. They heard the final, damning click of the steel cuffs. When the video ended, Chen let the silence hang in the air for a long moment before saying, "No further questions for this witness, Your Honor." He then called Kyle Miller to the stand. It was a brutal cross-examination. Chen forced Miller to watch the video again, pausing it at key moments. "Mr. Miller, in this frame, is Captain Ramirez threatening you?" "He was non-compliant." "Is he threatening you, sir? Yes or no?" "No." "And in this frame, where he is explaining the mortal danger you are in, is he obstructing you? Or is he trying to save your life?" Miller stammered, contradicted himself, and wilted under the relentless questioning. He tried to cling to the narrative from his false report, but it crumbled into dust when compared with the objective reality of the video. The jury saw him not as a peace officer, but as a bully who had lost control. Chen's final witness was a use-of-force expert, a retired police chief, who testified that Miller's actions were a complete departure from accepted police standards. There was no basis for the arrest, the expert concluded. It was one of the most egregious abuses of authority I have seen in my 40-year career. The county's defense had no answer. They couldn't dispute the video. They couldn't rehabilitate Miller's credibility. They were fighting a battle they couldn't win. In his closing argument, Chen simply played a 1-minute clip from the video one last time, the moment from the shove to the click of the handcuffs. He let it play in silence. "They say a picture is worth 1,000 words," he said to the jury as the video faded to black. "That video is worth millions, not just in damages, but as a message. A message that this kind of abuse of power will not be tolerated. Send that message." The trial by video was over. The only thing left was for the jury to decide the price of ego. The jury was out for less than 2 hours. For a civil trial of this magnitude, it was an astonishingly short deliberation. It was a clear signal that they were not divided. They had reached a swift and unified consensus. When the bailiff announced that they had a verdict, a ripple of anticipation went through the packed courtroom. Mike Ramirez sat at the plaintiff's table, his expression calm, but his hands were clasped tightly in front of him. David Chen gave him a slight, confident nod. Kyle Miller and the county attorneys looked pale and grim. They knew what was coming. A short deliberation never boded well for the defense. The jury filed back into the jury box. They avoided making eye contact with the defense table, another telltale sign of a plaintiff's victory. The jury forewoman, a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense expression, handed the verdict form to the bailiff, who in turn handed it to the judge. The judge reviewed the document for a moment, his face betraying no emotion. In the matter of Ramirez versus the County of San Marcos, et al., on the claim of unlawful arrest and violation of the Fourth Amendment, how do you find? The forewoman stood up, her voice clear and steady. We find for the plaintiff, Captain Michael Ramirez. A quiet sigh of relief went through the firefighters sitting in the gallery. On the claim of intentional infliction of emotional distress, how do you find? The judge continued. We find for the plaintiff, Captain Michael Ramirez. One by one, the judge went through the list of claims. For each one, the verdict was the same. The jury had sided with Ramirez on every single point. They had completely and utterly rejected the county's narrative and accepted David Chen's. Ramirez had been vindicated. But the most stunning part was yet to come. We will now address the matter of damages, the judge said, looking at the final page of the verdict form. For compensatory damages, including emotional distress, damage to reputation, and violation of civil rights, what amount do you award? The forewoman took a deep breath. The jury awards the plaintiff the sum of $7,700,000. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. $7.7 million. It was an enormous figure, far beyond what even the most optimistic court watchers had predicted. The county's lead attorney visibly sagged in his chair, his head falling into his hands. But the jury wasn't finished. And on the matter of punitive damages against the defendant, Kyle Miller, intended to punish past conduct and deter future conduct, what amount do you award? This was the money to be paid directly by Miller, a sum meant to punish him personally for his malicious conduct. We award punitive damages in the amount of $1 million, the forewoman announced. Miller looked as if he had been punched in the gut. He was ruined, facing a debt he could never hope to repay. Finally, the judge asked the last, most important question. And on the matter of punitive damages against the defendant, the County of San Marcos, to punish the department for its failure to properly train and supervise its deputies and to deter future misconduct. What amount do you award? The forewoman looked directly at the county's lawyers, her expression hard. The jury awards punitive damages in the amount of $20 million. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. $20 million, added to the other awards. The grand total was an unbelievable $28.7 million. It was not just a verdict. It was an indictment. It was a historic, earth-shattering number designed to bring a government agency to its knees. The jury hadn't just sent a message. They had launched a financial missile straight into the heart of the sheriff's department. Ramirez sat in stunned silence for a moment, the numbers washing over him. It had never been about the money, but the sheer scale of the verdict was a powerful affirmation of the injustice he had suffered. He felt a hand on his shoulder and looked up to see David Chen smiling. "They heard you, Captain," Chen said quietly. "They heard you." The judge banged his gavel, calling for order. But the verdict had already been delivered. It would be the headline on every news channel that night. It would force a complete overhaul of the sheriff's department's training and policies. It would become a case study taught in law schools and police academies for years to come. The jury had done exactly what David Chen had asked of them. They had held power accountable. They had seen the truth on the video, and they had assigned it a price tag. And that price was high enough to ensure that the lesson of Oak Creek Drive would never be forgotten. The verdict hadn't just shaken the county. It had set a new standard for justice. In the aftermath of the verdict, the consequences rippled outward, touching everyone involved. For Kyle Miller, the judgment was a life sentence of debt and disgrace. His name was now synonymous with police misconduct. The State Post Board completed its review and permanently revoked his law enforcement certification. He would never wear a badge again, in any capacity, in any state. The $1 million in punitive damages forced him into bankruptcy. His once promising future had been completely and irrevocably erased, all for a few minutes of unchecked ego on a suburban street. His former partner, John Evans, served his suspension and returned to the department. But his career was over. He would spend the rest of his working life in the records division, a pariah trusted by no one, a walking cautionary tale of what happens when you fail to do the right thing. The sheriff's department was plunged into a period of painful reform. The $28, $7 million verdict, which the county's taxpayers would ultimately have to pay, was a political and financial cataclysm. Sheriff Thompson, facing immense pressure, announced his retirement. His successor was brought in from the outside with a clear mandate: clean house. The department was forced into a federally monitored consent decree. Training protocols were completely rewritten. A new mandatory duty to intervene policy was implemented, explicitly holding officers legally and professionally accountable for failing to stop misconduct by their partners. It became known department-wide, unofficially, as the Ramirez Rule. For Captain Mike Ramirez, life returned to a semblance of normalcy. But he was changed. He was hailed as a hero within the fire service, a symbol of integrity and professionalism. He continued to lead Engine 12, responding to calls, saving lives, and commanding scenes with the same calm authority he had always possessed. He donated a significant portion of his settlement to a charity for the families of fallen first responders and set up a foundation to provide better cross-disciplinary training between police and fire agencies. He never wanted another officer, cop or firefighter, to go through what he had. He had been tested in a way he'd never expected, not by fire or twisted metal, but by a challenge to his character. He had held his ground, trusted the system, and emerged not just vindicated, but as a catalyst for profound change. His actions had ensured that the cost of ego was now clearly written into his county's budget, a multi-million-dollar reminder for generations of deputies to come. The integrity of one man had proven more powerful than the misplaced authority of another, and the entire county was safer for it. The incident on Oak Creek Drive became a legend, a story told in firehouses and police academies. It was a stark lesson that the most dangerous thing at an emergency scene is not always the fire or the wreckage or the live wire, but the human element of pride. And on that day, the price of that pride was measured, weighed, and found to be worth exactly $28.7 million. As we look back on the events of that day, it's easy to see it as a simple story of right versus wrong, of a good captain and a bad deputy. But the reality is always more complex, born from 1,000 small decisions and deeply ingrained human flaws. What really drove Kyle Miller's actions? It likely wasn't a conscious decision to be malicious. It was something more insidious, a deep-seated insecurity masked by arrogance. In his world, authority was a zero-sum game. For him to have it, someone else had to lose it. When Captain Ramirez, an expert in his field, established a boundary, Miller didn't hear a safety warning. He heard a challenge to his identity as the man in charge. His ego, fragile and overinflated, couldn't withstand the perceived slight. What if, in that crucial moment, he had been able to pause and listen? What if he had possessed the humility to say, "I don't understand this hazard. Captain, explain it to me"? The entire catastrophe could have been averted. The incident would have ended with a handshake, not handcuffs. His career would have continued, and the county would be $28.7 million richer. It's a powerful reminder that true strength isn't about projecting authority, but about having the wisdom to recognize when someone else knows more than you do. And what about Captain Ramirez? Could he have done anything differently to protect himself? It's hard to see how. He followed his training perfectly. He remained calm. He articulated the danger. He cited the law. Perhaps, if he had known the kind of man he was dealing with, he could have called for a police supervisor the moment the conflict began. But that's a burden that shouldn't be placed on him. He did everything right in a situation where someone else was determined to do everything wrong. His greatest defense was not his words or his actions, but his unwavering professionalism, which shone through so clearly on the camera footage that ultimately became his vindication. This story, in the end, is about more than just a wrongful arrest. It's about the corrosive nature of ego and the quiet power of integrity. It teaches us that true authority is not granted by a badge or a uniform, but is earned through competence, respect, and the quiet confidence to do the right thing, especially when no one is watching, or when everyone is. What do you think? Have you ever witnessed someone in a position of authority let their ego get the best of them? How important is it for first responders from different agencies to respect each other's expertise? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and be sure to support the channel for more stories like this.